Good morning, everybody, and welcome to your next session. My name is Tina Flatau, and I'm going to be taking you through a 15-minute ride as we look at Brave New World as a topic. Now, just to introduce myself, I hope quite a few people have seen me here before. I'm a biotech CEO. I have been chair and I'm now a board member of a rare disease patient charity. I sit on ethics committee, NHS NLA ethics committee, and I have a strong interest in patient-centric aspects to drug development and the advantages of those. Brave New World. Well, I work with small biotech companies, as I've said, and they develop novel therapies. This year has been a year for them, for the patient organisations I work with, and for everybody in our world, a year like never before. Suddenly, the healthcare industry, just for once, isn't only appearing in the public eye when we're the bad guys in a Hollywood movie, but we've suddenly been of the most high public interest. So governments, now can triumph or fail based on what our industry can pull out of the hat. The life science industry has, I think, more than risen to the challenge. I'm extremely proud of what we've achieved this year from a standing start. So we've all seen how science and technology-driven collaborations can race ahead with breakthroughs. We've all seen how patients have accepted and even welcomed completely different kinds of remote healthcare delivery. It's also been interesting to witness how well the population at large have come to comply with health rules, positively or negatively. And there's undoubtedly been a new willingness of a large proportion of people to share their health data by logging into monitoring apps on a daily basis. So all of these sudden turns in behaviours are things that we couldn't have predicted. So in this session, I want us to talk about some of the changes that may become embedded in the way that we work. And for me, in particular, how patients have become more involved in healthcare development and interest. So I'm going to introduce our very good panel in alphabetical order. And I'm going to start with Breen. He's head of public-private partnerships and science policy at Takeda. He's got more than 30 years experience in the pharma industry, having delivered global clinical development programs at Pfizer, GSK and AstraZeneca. At Takeda, he's leading engagement in more than 80 large public-private partnerships and the science policy function in R&D. His role involves building relationships and delivering large healthcare projects with policy influencers, academic institutions, and patient organisations, as well as other relevant healthcare groups. So in a really good position to comment on some of these collaborations that we've seen charging up this year. Secondly, Helen Barker. Helen is head of pharmaceutical development at Reneo Pharma Limited. They're developing clinical stage candidates for genetic mitochondrial diseases. She's enjoyed a range of positions at Pfizer, Novartis, and startup companies, and the University of Oxford. She's also the founder and managing director of Project Iron Limited, supporting the development of biotech and non-profit organisations. I'm very pleased to welcome back Flic Gabbay to a panel. She's the managing partner of Transcript, a specialist drug development company, and also vice president of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine. Very known to many of you, she's held a number of senior and board level positions in big pharma and CEO positions in biotechs and CROs in Europe and North America. Flic started her career in big pharma, Rome Pelon, which is now Sanofi, and Park Davis, which is now Pfizer. Transcript has a history of being heavily involved in novel clinical development programs, including for rare disease, cell and gene therapy, and more recently, COVID-19. We also have David Hawkins with us. David comes from a finance background, and he's founder and chief executive of Remedium Capital, a very interesting proposition. So as I said, his background is in corporate finance. He subsequently has led 2 strategic initiatives with CROs, both Covance and Icon, in alternative R&D financing. Close family illness inspired and drove him to address the increasing number of innovative medicines that are bogged down in reimbursement, where payer and sponsor expectations are misaligned because of a lack of mature evidence of patient benefit. David's company, Remedium Capital, has worked with NovaQuest to develop a proprietary risk-sharing approach to reimbursement, structured reimbursement we call it, and it accelerates access, or aims to accelerate access, by bridging the gap in expectations between sponsor and payer. More on that later. Lastly, Graham Wylie is a physician and founder and CEO of MRN, a job he's had for the last 15 years. He spent 10 years at Pfizer in drug development and 5 years at Parexel, finishing as VP of Sales in Europe. Graham is an entrepreneur. He spent his career building new capabilities, organizations, and companies. He specializes in taking new ideas and making them work. MRN grew from a management buyout of healthcare at home to be the biggest nursing provider in the clinical trial sector. So we have people here who can talk about how the big companies are doing things differently, how the regulators and how people that we need to please are doing things differently, how we're going to finance it differently, and how we're going to work differently. Well, as I hope you'll agree, we've got a good panel here. What I'm going to do now is to kick off with some sort of expansive questions. But before I do so, what I'd like to do so that the audience can get their bearings with our panelists is to invite each panelist in turn to give me a little bit of an idea of what their thoughts are on our Brave New World topic. And I'm going to start with Sean, if you don't mind, Sean, and invite you to spend a couple of minutes just expanding on that for us, and then we'll move to the other panelists.
Yeah, thanks, Tina, and yeah, happy to do that. Look, when I was thinking about this topic and thinking about our Brave New World, I was thinking about how we're going to partner and how we're going to collaborate in that Brave New World, particularly you know, in the open innovation space, the pre-competitive space, and what I've observed, you know, particularly when I look at partnerships involving public and private partners, is that the diversity in those types of partnerships, the diversity of groups coming together from around the world to solve significant healthcare problems, can be hugely powerful in driving new innovation. So, you know, when you get involved in those types of partnerships, the combined wisdom around the table, if you like, the combined wisdom around in the room of more than 30 plus partners can really give new insights into solving complex healthcare problems that we all face. Another part of, you know, that kind of collaboration is bringing shared resources, you know, thinking about data, sharing data across organizations, sharing technology and looking to further technology to figure out how to best implement technology. And then, of course, there's the human element, you know, the expertise that's brought into those types of partnerships that really can drive new innovation and drive new ways to solve complex healthcare problems. And also, just building on your opening remarks, Tina, I'm thinking about that patient centricity piece. One key trend that, you know, we're certainly observing in those types of partnerships is more and more patient organizations and sometimes individual patients are getting involved in those types of partnerships, because it's a great way for them to connect with multiple different pharma companies, academic organizations from around the world who are leaders in particular disease areas, and also policymakers and policy influencers within that environment. So it's a great way to get patient organizations involved through those open innovation, pre-competitive PPP space. And then finally, just thinking about the last year, as you were saying in your opening remarks, is that I think more than ever we've realized that when we face, you know, complex healthcare challenges like COVID-19, that no one organization can go it alone. No one organization can solve that kind of problem. So we do need to be collaborating and partnering in new ways in this brave new world.
Thanks very much, Sean, and I think you really hit the nail on the head there. So who would have thought it, eh? You know, sharing data, sharing resources, sharing expertise. Fantastic. And Helen, I'm going to put the spotlight on you now and ask you to give us your 2 penny words.
Thanks, Tina. I'll be delighted to. So I would say that although a pandemic was inevitable at some point, I don't think many of us, if any, were truly prepared. From my perspective, I believe our careers, and certainly mine in early development of new medicines, is great preparation for any circumstance like this, which requires rapid, resilient and adaptive responsiveness. At Reneo, as Tina mentioned, we do focus on rare genetic disorders, mitochondrial function. Working with patients in the rare and orphan spaces has presented as many challenges and opportunities over the last year. From the immediate issues, the breaking of the news of individual risk mitigation and changes in supply chain management, which has required some very exquisite management to keep things moving, has from that to increased attendance and engagement at patient meetings, which has been quite a fantastic boon, I think, for many of us. In essence, the learning curve has been as steep as it's been exciting. Changes have meant breaking the mold so far, and I think that will continue, and welcome that. I think there's a challenge in there because we all know how much we, and particularly our partners, love SOPs. So being able to change some of those procedures and the cultures that go along with them has been quite challenging along the way. But I think that really has opened up opportunities for much more rapid change and development and improvement in how we work and develop medicines. Having worked at the University of Oxford in infectious diseases research, including leading the patient and public involvement element, I have to say the variety and volume of patient input is quite distinct from such a broad area as infectious diseases compared to the rare and orphan space. So I can speak to the big data element, but also the more patient, small group, rare and orphan focus. For Reneo, the increase in patient involvement in our research has really enhanced our trials already, from their conduct and the patient perspective to further improving our PROs. So we just recently made a submission in which we've been able to improve our PROs on the basis of information we've gathered over the last 9 months. So that's instant impact for me, which has been fantastic. My hope is that our open discussion between and within our organisations of the threats and opportunities brought by the pandemic are not lost, and are used to enhance the way that we develop and provide access to new medicines alongside and with our patients.
That's fantastic, thank you. I must say, I mean, all of those things about rare disease development resonate. You know, when I worked in rare disease R&D, you know, we used to say there is no development pathway, we have to make it ourselves. You know, and it goes back to my days at PwC where we used to sell live re-engineering of projects where you just have to take a machete for all those procedures if you actually wanted to make any progress. I think everyone's been experiencing that this year. Now, for a dose of perhaps a little bit more wisdom and reality check, I'm going to pass on to you, Flic, because you're actually seeing how these you know, ideas and hopes are potentially going to be made into reality at the coalface of development with payers, etc., and regulators.
Yes, it's been a very interesting year, and I think that a lot of the change has for us, in spite of lockdown, been related to communication and access, because we suddenly have access to patients in a way that we didn't before, because our clinical trial monitors and all the intervening pieces of the CROs have actually had to be curtailed so that clinical trials now are dealing directly with patients, and rather like Graham with his healthcare at home, who are now moving into looking at whether or not we can manage research that way. This has brought something which is quite different in the approach. We've got trials running where the patients sit at home, the drugs are couriered to them, we interview them, show them how to use their treatments, how to measure what's going on a video, and or on the Zoom link, and that is completely different from anything we've ever done before. And for things like rare disease, as opposed to COVID, of course, that would mean that we can extend the trials and therefore patient access in the long term to groups of people who are spread in quite different parts of the world, rather than focusing them around secondary healthcare centres, which limits the access that the developers have. And I think the other thing that's happened is the whole acceleration thing in the pandemic, which is not always entirely good, in the sense that people find themselves working from 7 in the morning till 9 in the evening without even batting an eyelid, which would probably not have happened before, certainly not sitting in one place in front of a computer screen. But this acceleration of the rolling reviews, which was originally supposed to be brought into regulatory authorities, but much more slowly, has really moved things much faster. And I have been watching Brave New World on Sky because I always enjoyed the book, so I thought it was a very interesting interpretation. But it does remind me that not everything is good about a Brave New World. And we have to be very careful about how we structure the way we govern it and organize it. And one of the things that has come out of that, for particularly in clinical research, is the challenges of suddenly going to completely different trial designs, using real world data in ways we've not used it before. And we have to be sure that that evidence is robust. And at the speed we're working, that is a huge challenge. So I think there are lots of good things about what's happening and the inclusivity of it all and the collaboration and so on. But I think we have to take great care to be sure that we are applying the same robust levels of evidence judgment that we have before.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure a lot of people would echo that. I would say my Brave New World is the Shakespearean Miranda good Brave New World, about how amazing people are. You know, only someone who never sees people like Miranda can appreciate how marvelous mankind is, and I think we're seeing what we can all do in a more marvelous way now. But yes, a reality check is definitely going to be what's needed, I think. Anyway, I'm going to move on now to David, whom I only met for the first time virtually recently, David Hawkins. And I must admit, I just thought, why hasn't that been invented before? That sounds like such a good idea. So David, over to you. Give us a little intro to how you get involved in all of this.
Yes, and thank you, Tina. I think probably before talking about a brave new post-COVID world, it's probably just worth reflecting very briefly on the pre-COVID world. And I think, you know, if you remember, if we cast our minds back, there was a revolution taking place both in cancer therapy and the wider application of cell and gene therapy. A revolution that was resulting in longer survival times and in some instances curative responses. I think despite this great news, however, healthcare systems were faced with two major economic challenges. The first was, you know, how to reward sponsors fairly in circumstances where such medicines, as often is the case, are approved based on clinical data, which is yet to demonstrate their full potential for patient benefit. And secondly, how to pay a significant amount today for patient benefit that is delivered essentially over a lifetime of tomorrows. I think in the UK, the pre-COVID world was, of course, also the pre-Brexit world, in which life sciences had been highlighted as one of the most important drivers of the UK economy. And it was recognized that for the industry to flourish here, the UK would need to offer fast access and reward innovation fairly. And as a result, the MHRA and its partner organizations were under pressure to provide a smooth regulatory pathway. And now there is a growing recognition that these efforts need to be matched by a response to an increasing prevalence of immature data and resulting reimbursement challenges. You know, simply put, and by way of example, there's little point in smoothing the way for CAR T therapies where clinical evidence is often immature. Unless the NHS has a structural response or a structural approach to the reimbursement of this product class, which is seen by all sides as fair. So how has COVID impacted our activities, and will it help bring about a brave new approach to reimbursement? I think, you know, fair to say it's initially COVID presented a significant challenge for us for the simple reason that payers were preoccupied, quite rightly, with even more pressing issues. we're hopeful, however, that the longer term impact of COVID, both on our activities and new approaches to reimbursement more generally, will be positive. First and foremost, healthcare, as we've seen mentioned today, like never before, is now very much seen as the cornerstone of the economy. And whilst budgetary pressures will cause payers to be even less willing to take reimbursement risk, we believe there will be probably greater political support for the adoption of structural solutions such as ours to help them mitigate risk. Secondly, we're hopeful that the reimbursement challenges that were large and growing pre-COVID will be met with a much greater openness to creativity. In the UK, that perfect storm of problem, COVID backlog, and looming Brexit is already, we believe, leading to greater engagement, certainly with ourselves. Finally, I think in the way that COVID forced the pace of adoption of telemedicine, we also expect an acceleration in the willingness of patients to engage in IT-based monitoring of both compliance and outcomes. And this is something that any outcomes-based approach to reimbursement will clearly benefit from. In summary then, I think, the challenges we were facing pre-COVID, both generally and within the UK, are clearly still very much alive and kicking. But our hope is that COVID will result in, firstly, greater political support, much greater openness to innovative solutions, and we suspect a much greater willingness on the part of patients to participate in those solutions.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And lastly, I just want to thank Graham for being so patient. Graham, of course, could throw the book at all of this because they've been doing a lot of this for forever. So, Graham, your thoughts really from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Tina. I think I don't want to speak for everybody, but I have a sense around the virtual table that certainly from my perspective, I feel like a bit of an old rocker who has enjoyed an overnight success after 33 years in the business. I guess everybody here is talking about things that have been going on for some considerable period of time, that we've been addressing issues which have been more chronic in the industry for a long time, since I can remember. And what we are seeing is an amazing opening up of the capacity of the audience, if you like, the participatory, the stakeholders. It's a huge opening up of their ability to adopt. I think that's a very powerful moment. So just to recap briefly so that people know what it is we do. The MRN is a clinical trial support organisation. We look after people in clinical trials and run the clinical trial visits in their own home. Of course, if that means we need to do it at work, or we need to do it at school, or we need to do it somewhere else, and we do that too. This is a very simple concept which has a lot of power, and fundamentally, it involves moving all of the logistics, all of the activities that you would undertake in a site, putting it in a patient's home. It would be a mistake, that's for sure, to think of this as you just send a nurse to take a blood. That's not how it works. It's a full-on clinical trial visit transported from the site into a patient's home. It's complicated, but it's entirely achievable. And in fact, it addresses many of the fundamental issues that have been slowing down the recruitment of patients into clinical trials and the retention of patients into clinical trials, which have been in a chronic downward spiral for a couple of decades at least. And I think the industry has been very open, actually, in recent years to finding ways to deal with those problems. And one of the truly intuitive ways of doing it is to reduce the impact of a clinical trial on a patient's life by making it easier for them. So when I started doing all of this 15 years ago, I would say to people, so we can run the trial visit in someone's home, and our customers, or pharma companies and CROs, would say, "Oh, really? that sounds good. How do you do that? And it's a very intuitive sell. The first thing they say is, that sounds like a good idea. It's an obviously good idea, isn't it? And I think it's true and applicable to all forms of healthcare. Fundamentally, it's about making a patient a stakeholder in the management of their disease, making them more engaged in the management of their condition, and addressing them as the owner of the problem, rather than either an asset that's moved around the chess table by sites or by CROs, or indeed just a vehicle for someone else to write a prescription and to make some cash out of a medicine. By putting the patient at the forefront as a stakeholder in both medicine and clinical research, I think we're doing everybody a significant favour. So from the point of view of what does the brave new world look like? Well, I mean, we all started thinking about the dystopian view of the world. It had not occurred to me to go and read the book again. It's a really good idea. And of course, I mean, we have lived through the most dystopian last few months, I think, that we could even ever possibly imagine. The upside, of course, is that the world is trying to resolve the problems that it sees in front of us. I think that's really powerful. I'm particularly impressed by the overcoming of inertia that is occurring in the sector as necessity drives innovation. We're seeing that in spades here, and I think the brave new world may be dystopic if you look at the politics and the economy, but in terms of healthcare and engagement of patients is actually in a very positive place. The only thing I would add as a caveat to all of this is capacity issues. Helen touched briefly on supply chain. I think it is a major new topic for an industry that hasn't really had to deal with, the trial industry hasn't really had to deal with supply chain issues that much. Supply chain is critical. We're a small business. I probably run something in the region of 25 to 30% of all home healthcare clinical trials around the globe. And I'm a little business. If you took all of me and all of everybody else and put them all in one pot, we couldn't even keep Pfizer alive. And I picked Pfizer because many of us worked there in the past. Pfizer's portfolio would swamp the entire industry that we work in today. The capacity constraints are going to be very real. We have to deal with those. Going to cause all sorts of new stresses and strains that we're not used to in the clinical trial environment.
Absolutely right. I mean, in the industry, we all think of all the boring practicalities. And while my family was skipping around the kitchen when the first vaccine was announced, I was thinking, my God, how are GPs going to get minus 80 degrees fridges? I mean, they just don't exist. So we're very boring, aren't we? So that brings me on to my first kind of broad question to this excellent panel. I'm so pleased with your input so far. It's so diverse and deep, your breadth of thought on this. So let's come back to sort of a nuggety question, which is, and I'm going to pick on Sean first, because Sean's a proper big pharma chap. And I'm going to ask you, Sean, I'm going to ask the others also to chip into this. But how have the life science industry's responses to the pandemic been genuinely disruptive? That word that we all love to speak about, have bandied about in our conference panels for years. Finally, it's the moment of disruption. Sean, what can you say?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And first of all, I just love your thinking around taking a machete to procedures, and Helen's point around ripping up SOPs, if you like. And just a couple of examples around how the industry has been disruptive and done exactly that, I would say. So if you look at the COVID R&D Alliance, for instance, which is an alliance of 20 biopharma companies coming together to work in different ways, completely different ways. And that was quickly formed in March, so very quickly in response to this. And one of the founding principles of that was ripping up the rule book and learning how to work in different ways. And some tangible elements that have come out of that and disruptive elements that have come out of that is really sifting through those 20 pharma portfolios to look for repurposed medicines that could be really analyzed using the expertise across those different companies to find the best medicines to move forward into clinical trials. And just thinking about that capacity point that Graham raised around, clinical sites, this is one way to help solve an element of that capacity challenge where pharma companies are looking at across those portfolios and thinking, how can we use the best minds in those organizations to really find the most promising medicines to put into clinical trials, not put all the medicines into clinical trials, just the most promising. And I think that helps in terms of clinical trial sites and managing capacity. Also, another tangible piece that they put up is platform trial and called I-SPY COVID. And there's been 3 new medicines which have been put into that I-SPY COVID platform trial. Again, that's implementing something that, as Graham says, we've been thinking about for many years, platform trials and not new, but actually here you have got pharma companies coming together in this indication, looking to implement in new ways. And the other piece is, and it builds on what Flic was saying, was really around how we use data. And here's a coalition, a consortium that's really thinking about combining data sources. Real world data, yes, from various different sources, also clinical trial data at the summary level and also at the individual patient level, and sharing that in completely new ways. And it's not just about those pharma companies working together. They've been working with NGOs, they've been working with the regulatory authorities, and has been to break down the barriers between those different organizations to work in very innovative and disruptive ways, I'd say. Just one final example, which is in Europe, which is the IMI Care Consortium, which is the Innovative Medicines Initiative Care Consortium, which is 37 different organizations coming together. Again, well, 11 of those are biopharma companies, but the rest are academic institutions, some patient organizations and regulatory authorities. The focus is on repurposing, also developing novel medicines to treat SARS-CoV-2. But the other piece of that, which I think is important, is future preparedness and really thinking about new antivirals for those future pandemics, which has been raised in this panel as well, and how we can come together to develop those new antivirals as well and new treatments for future pandemics. So I'd say the industry has been disrupted, but they haven't done it alone. They've partnered with lots of different organizations around the world they wouldn't normally partner with to make this happen, Tina.
Okay, interesting. Flic, I'm going to jump to you because I think you've sort of been at the practicality end of all of this. And I think as a company that provides services to a pharma development model that's been established for a very long time, I don't know whether Transcript has seen what's been disruptive in terms of approaches as something that sits neatly within the business model that you operate.
Well, I think picking up on the last thing that Sean said, interestingly enough, the first thing that we said when the pandemic hit was, I hope this won't be like the last influenza epidemic, because what happened then was that we had a number of medicines that were being developed. And then we stopped pretty much all antiviral research on the basis that vaccines would be the answer. And at the time, I wasn't working with Pfizer, but we had a license with Pfizer for inhaled interferon beta. And we had a lot of good primate data in influenza. And this collaboration that Sean is talking about never happened. We had the opportunity for it, and we started some of it. We did some stockpiling and we did a little bit, but we did not take it to the next level. And this pandemic has driven it to the next level, which I think is really important. We must not forget that antivirals themselves are really important, because it will always take 6 months to a year or longer to get a vaccine, even if we can get one. So I think that's the first important point, but it has been disruptive in other ways, and not least to other areas besides COVID. I sit on a working party with ABPI, and with we have MHRA coming into it periodically, looking at what we can do with the future of clinical trials to make sure that we continue this disruption on, so that they are better in the future and they are resilient to some of the issues we've faced this year. It's called the Resilience Working Party, but we are looking at the whole way. It's this concept of ripping up SOPs. What can we do with the protocol and with the way we go about doing clinical trials that we have learned from here that we can put into other clinical trials, not just infection clinical trials, but also the trials in oncology, in rare disease, and all the other trends that we're looking at. So we're hoping that's going to shed some light on things, but it has been a much more difficult exercise than we thought, which is interesting, in the sense that we put out a survey and people struggled to be able to articulate what we needed to do next. They know what they're doing now, and it's working in terms of directly linking with patients, doing Zoom calls to patients, delivering materials by courier, and all the things that Graham is talking about. But what do we do next that we maintain this disruption so that the clinical trial environment is a better place? Not just for infection, which is very close to my heart. I've worked on inhaled interferon beta for 14 years, I think. And only now have we managed to get it out there as a potential general antiviral treatment. And I think that we do need to see this as something that is driving a better environment, better and more efficient clinical trials that are more flexible and robust in terms of analytical information, but also much more practical to run, and does build on the fact that we're getting to patients and we're rolling that into care. And I think the IMI Care Consortium is very important in that respect, because it is essential to make sure that clinical trials actually are seen in the light of the fact that they will be embedded in clinical care in the future, which sometimes we lose a little bit of sight of, I think.
Tina, you're muted, I think.
So I am, yes. No, good point. Helen, I was going to say, I can see you nodding away at some of the points that Flic was making, but I noted in some of your comments before today, you had a pinch of skepticism about how change and positive change that both Sean and Flic have cited, will become embedded. I mean, what is your thought on how that could actually be enacted?
Well, I think to build on Flic's point about anti-infectives for a start, we've already seen a great revelation in antivirals, antimicrobials being developed, and then a sudden drop-off in support and financing over the last 10 plus years, which I think is something that we really do need to make a change about globally very quickly, in light of there's so much government investment at the moment into antimicrobial resistance, etc. But we haven't got the funding or the infrastructure currently to support the development of those new anti-infectives. I think the Cell Sentry, the CCR5 antagonist I was involved with at Pfizer, that was one of the last great things, certainly, that Pfizer came out with as an anti-infective. And it was one of those things that turned for HIV, as for example, as another pandemic, from a death sentence into a chronic illness. So I think with examples like that, I'm not quite sure how we can justify not making that disruptive change as a result of this pandemic.
I'm going to jump to Graham next, and then I'm going to circle very nicely, neatly to David, because we brought in some of those kind of financial enablement points. But Graham, I think just before that, Helen was making some points about how on earth, we make these jumps have a lasting change. And unfortunately, she's had to cite some pretty negative sort of events, health events that have in the past prompted us to do things differently. I mean, do you think this is just another one of those that we will look back in a few years' time and say, yes, some good things came out of that, but we're still in the world that we're in?
I have to say that I think the answer to that is yes. When you're in the middle of an event, it always feels like it's the most important thing ever. But later, when you look back, I think, we do have short memories, and I don't think it's going to be minor. I think we will look back on this like we look back on HIV, actually. I think it's going to be major. And this won't be the only one. I mean, this is the third. It's just the first that's made it out of the Far East. This is going to happen again. So I think we'll be living in a different world from that perspective, and I think that's an important thing for us to learn from. I think disruption in principle, though, at the moment, I would go back to some sort of standard thoughts about adoption to address some of the questions relating to the trial world in particular, rather than what interest we might have in new therapeutic areas. From a perspective of making trials faster and more efficient, and making them more patient-centric, I think what we're looking at here is an adoption curve. We know that the adoption curves have a sort of dip in them and they carry on up with time. And we've just been given a big shunt down that adoption curve. But adoption curves are slow. It's a 17-year adoption curve in the healthcare system. And really, that's only the first phases. If you look at the adoption curve stats, we're still adopting the car. It's only sort of got to about 65% penetration in the global population. So these things it depends on your perspective and how you look at them at any given time. But the adoption curve in our world, I think, has just been given a major shove. We're probably seeing about 4 years impact within a year, and I think that's good. The question is, what's going to happen next? How much will we be left with? And I'm sure we'll come back to that topic in another question. I think we do have to focus on, I'm going to call it the stress of the environment that we sit in at the moment. When disruption is in place, it's stressful because everything's changing. And I think it really is stressful at the moment. And I don't just mean that in terms of anxiety. I mean in terms of all the stresses and strains that it places on the infrastructure and the processes that we follow and have. And I don't think we're going to find it easy to deal with that, despite the fact that the disruption is positive in its general nature. You only have to look at what we do. We get lots of sites worried about what we do because they think it's going to stop them doing the work that they do. It needn't. We're quite collaborative and partnering with sites, but the risk profile is going up. There's more money coming into the market. There's more people going to put money into technology, into new systems. And people, if you ask the question, what are you going to do next? You almost never get a good answer. Right? What you have to do is say, what are you going to do with this? And you show it to them and they go, oh, I could do a lot with that. That's how people think. Just giving them a blank piece of paper, tends not to work. So what you're seeing here is the opportunity for us to put lots of things on the table. And then I think you'll get a huge creative wave come through this, and that will be disruptive in some sense. So I think it's good. I think it's frightening. I think it's stressful, but I think it's ultimately going to be beneficial for everybody.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think the point about shunting forward the adoption curve is a very interesting one. But I think what we're doing now is we're reframing things, like the fact that we're pulling patients in and actually saying, what do you think? What do you actually want, while we're here? Shall we ask you that just for once? I think this tantalising thing brings us back to Graham's proposition, though, because, I'm hearing people talk about not having the development finance infrastructure, not being able to, having a fear that, what we've done differently won't be delivered long term because of the improved benefit. And I think a lot of those play into a very interesting idea that we have this different proposition about how we deliver benefit, measure benefit, and therefore look at what's beneficial. So, Dave, I'd really like you to comment on those. And I'd particularly like you to say, I hope the adoption curve is going to be shortened from 17 years, which I think is a depressing thought.
You know, Tina, it's really interesting listening to the others about disruption. I think in my intro you mentioned that I'd led some strategic initiatives on behalf of CROs, and quite often, you know, no matter how acute the problem, how compelling the solution, and how good the timing, you know, you're often faced with entrenched system forces in very large bureaucratic organizations that, you know, make it very difficult to get them to think in different ways. And you know, it's interesting to see that, you know, it's a real crisis that's finally caused large bureaucratic organizations with those system forces to approach the world you know, differently. The question is, you know, how long is that appetite for change actually going to last? And, you know, I certainly hope it does, because it's, you know, it certainly stood in the way of some of the things that I've tried to do in the past, which have, you know, been, you know, really interesting areas. I think in terms of the sort of the reimbursement piece, you know, we're sort of at the end of all of this, I guess, in terms of how medicines are ultimately rewarded and how innovation's ultimately rewarded. And I don't think we've necessarily seen any revolution taking place there, but I do see that what's happened has really laid the foundations for potentially quite a lot of change. And I think much in a way will depend upon how government really seizes upon the current sort of, you know, goodwill and the relationship with the healthcare industry to, you know, to make that change. And a very simple example that we're confronted with is that, you know, perhaps some people won't appreciate is just how HM Treasury thinks in terms of how it actually pays for medicines. You know, it not necessarily how it pays for medicines, but when it pays for medicines. You know, we can have very innovative proposals in terms of how medicine should be reimbursed, but there are very simple things that potentially stand in the way of some, you know, quite innovative thinking. So, you know, from my perspective, I just see, you know, I referred to this sort of perfect storm of problem, of COVID, of pre-Brexit. Actually, I'm hoping that will put sufficient pressure on the MHRA and its partner organizations to think in a different way about how medicine should be reimbursed and how that should be done fairly. And there is an opportunity, as I say, for government and HM Treasury to actually make some changes. And I do hope that this pressure will lead to that.
Oh, that's extraordinary. And well, I mean, I think if embed the benefits becomes the next big project that comes out of all of this. I really, you know, we've had one question because we've all had such depth of view on this. It's such an expansive topic, and I'm thrilled by that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump round the panel in kind of reverse order and ask for you to give me your summary 10-15 seconds, which is unfair, but I just want people to go away with some of these ideas ringing in their ears. And I'm going to jump on Graham first, I'm afraid, and not give you time to think. And just, you know, Graham, in a nutshell, you know, what would you like us to be able to say to the world outside about what's happened and what should happen going forward?
Well, I think in a nutshell, it's about consolidation. There's lots of ideas. We need to try them. We need to adopt them and see how they go. I would have said that embracing new technology, embracing new methods that are born out of this environment would be the most positive thing that we can do. And you know, there are lots of pressures around patient centricity, real world data, clinical trials as a trial option, which are probably suffering in the same way. And
no, thanks. I'm sorry, I'll stop you there, Graham, because really sorry. Really quickly get around to everybody. Helen, I'm going to jump to you next. 10 seconds on, you know, what you want. You've already
couple of key points, I guess,
Yeah.
for me. I think I'll just reiterate: funding for antimicrobials, patient centricity is hugely important, and how we enact that and make the best out of it, which includes not just bringing them in on the research, but also the feedback loop to help them understand, get the empowerment from the input that they're giving, the feedback. And I think finally that to reiterate the point about big data and applications, and the fact that we're probably going to see more computer scientists rubbing shoulders with our developers in the near future.
Yeah, I completely agree. Besides, if we don't do it, Google, Amazon, etc., will do it anyway. Flic, I'm going to come to you for your final thoughts.
Infection is incredibly important. It is the end point of most oncology patients. It is really important that we take antifungals, antibiotics, and especially antivirals seriously. And I think we need to learn a lot from trial design that we've learned this year, or at least has come to the fore this year going forward.
Excellent, thank you very much. Sean?
Yeah, Tina, I think if we look at this last year, science has really stood up, and scientific organizations around the world have stood up to fight this pandemic. And that gives me great hope. It gives me great hope for the future, that we can collaborate better in the future to tackle some of these complex challenges that others have spoken about, including AMR.
Yeah, I agree too. And David, I think we look to you.
Well, I think interesting, and rather sadly, I suspect 12 months post-COVID, we will all become very complacent about our health. That's the way the population works. So I think the answer here ultimately is down to leadership and the extent to which leadership learns from these lessons and tries to embed this sort of openness to change and openness to innovation in their sort of corporate ethos and the way they manage their organizations.
I agree. Okay, well, let's hope that there isn't complacency in the title of next year's panel. I just have to thank all of you, Graham and Flic and Helen and Sean and David, for being such a fantastic panel. I've never, ever only had one question. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Tina.
Thanks, Tina.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody, bye-bye.
Everybody.